Financial support for this program provided by Sacramento County's Transit Occupancy Tax Grant Program.
How do we define who we are? And why does it matter in civic life? In a county as diverse as Sacramento, identity isn't just personal. It shapes how we engage and how we are seen. Today we are joined by Dr. Mindy Romero and Dr. Richard Pan to explore identity, belonging, and representation in our diverse region. Dr. Pan, given that our diversity and the individuals that make up the fabric of the region are so complex, how does diversity and identification show up in Sacramento differently than it does in other places?
Well, Sacramento is a very special place because we are one of the most diverse areas in the whole country. We've seen this in several censuses. In fact, we got on the cover of Time magazine for having one of the most diverse metropolitan areas. And when I say diversity, it's just not the number of people of different races, ethnicities, so forth. It's also the level of integration as well. So we don't...
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so in a lot of places, people sort of have assigned places where they're supposed to live, right? The expectation. So you have one area that's one community, in one group, another. And while I'm not saying that we don't see some of that in Sacramento, we are much more integrated. So we tend to have a mix of people living together in different neighborhoods here in Sacramento. And that does make us stand out amongst many other metropolitan areas in the United States.
Dr. Romero, you spend your time looking at voting patterns and representation and things like that. Because of what Dr. Pan just mentioned in terms of how we're not as balkanized as, say, a city back east, where you've got this community here and it's very geographically compact and discrete, and another one over here, but people are kind of more mixed together. Mm-hmm. How is that interesting when you're looking at voting and representation and how people show up in terms of their participation in civic life, like elections and things like that?
So I think it depends on how you want to look at it.
Okay.
So patterns still remain. We are still segregated, although less than many places around the country. Mm-hmm. And we also are very much income segregated as well. We do have integrated neighborhoods in terms of income, but we do have areas of our city and of the county, the larger metropolitan region, that are lower income, right, and higher income. And if you look at patterns of participation, there's voting numbers where we do see communities of color, generally speaking, lower income communities having less of a voice, less representation amongst voters, having lower turnout. But then there's, aside from voting, which is a lot of what I spend my work on, but there's also, community activism and meetings and lots of efforts in the region to bring people together, to create opportunities for people to have a larger voice, to get a neighborhood park established, or to raise economic mobility options, right, in a particular community, or to bring business in, or whatever it might be. We do have a lot of activism. We have a lot of elected officials that are very well also integrated into their communities, working with their communities, neighborhood by neighborhood. Still lots of room for growth, right, and more engagement and working together. But there is a lot of not just community level, but also a kind of cross work that we see where organizations reach out to each other to share, to envision together, right, to try to draw people from different issues into one larger, right, set of kind of activism. And that's really exciting. And we don't often see that, I think, to that degree in other areas of the country.
And actually, interesting enough, I moved from the East Coast to Sacramento. Came from Boston. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where, frankly, people were much more segregated in terms of race, ethnicity. And when I came to Sacramento, one of the things that particularly struck me was that in Sacramento, there was a lot of interest in community building. And what I mean by that is that people really were thinking about how do we build these interconnections. Now, you're right, we're not always entirely connecting everybody, but I think there was an investment in that. In fact, Sierra Health Foundation at the time had the community partnerships for healthy children. They were trying to build stronger neighborhoods. I was able to leverage that to help start a program at UC Davis to get doctors out in the community and build those connections. But I also make note, because I'm a former elected official as well, you're right. Lower income, less resource communities generally tend to vote less, but also I noticed campaigns tend to invest less in those communities. And in fact, in one of my campaigns, I think one of the reasons I believe I won was because we decided to invest in turning out people in some of those communities where normally most people would not, because it's a little more expensive, takes a bit more effort because they tend to have lower voting rates. But by doing so, we were able to engage them and get them to turn out at a higher rate. And they did tend to vote for me, so I appreciate that.
Well, Senator, one of the things that brings up is that it seems to me, and I've been here since 1973, and that things have changed in that not only in how people identify themselves, which I would think is becoming much more challenging for people in your line of work, because people are like, with all of the intermingling in a place like Sacramento County, it's becoming more complicated as to what thing someone is on what day, because they're both and more, right?
Right.
But at the same time, but that's showing up in sort of the cultural fabric of how people express themselves. As an example, when I got here in '73, we would not have had the Day of the Dead, which is a traditional Mexican-American and Hispanic celebration, have so much prominence on all of the major stations with festivals and things like that. It would have been more of a segregated community activity. But today, you've got, everything from, the Greek festival and the Italian festival and,
New Year,
Chinese New Year and all that.
All that, right? Yeah.
But one of the things that people say when we talk about what makes this community sticky is someone says, my child has grown up with like a range of friends that I couldn't replicate anywhere else. And my neighbors are not all like me, and we think that that's a wonderful thing. And so that's kind of special about this region, even though, not dispelling at all the fact that, income and some other indices show that we are still highly segregated. So the question, the question is, how does that challenge, for instance, the work that you previously did on the census, how does that challenge capturing the richness of that diversity while still making that data useful?
Right. Well, I used to serve on the National Advisory Committee for the Census. Unfortunately, it was disbanded by this administration. But we were looking at how do we ensure that we count everyone, all right? So in the 2020 census at the state, I chaired the select committee on the 2020 census. We spent a lot of time and effort working with community groups to be sure people understood how important the census was so that we could get accurate information about what's going on. And what that data shows is that basically, not only do we have a diverse population, we talked about the integration level, but that we think about that as opportunities for our communities, for our governments, to really engage a broader swath, right, of people, that it's not, that people recognize it's not all about, well, I just need to cater to one group, all right, and then that's all I need to do. And one of the things that I think it's important, unfortunately, it seems like DEI is, quote, a dirty word now, but when you stop and think about it, let's not say DEI, let's say diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And so you talked about, like, when you came here, and your kids growing up, and I came here and my kids grew up in this neighborhood, and they were, their schools were much more diverse than when I grew up. What happens is that the cultural diversity that we see, those backgrounds, like all those other festivals and so forth, they're not like foreign things or objects of, fascination just because they're exotic. They're actually familiar, right? Because, hey, I have a classmate or actually a group of classmates who celebrated that, right? And so forth. It becomes...
Or their parents took you with them.
Right, exactly. In other words, it's normal to see all this stuff going on, and to know that people celebrate different things in different ways, and to celebrate it with them, and for them to celebrate with you. And I think that now, the question is, how does that show up in our larger, whether political life, economic life, and other types of things? But I do, that's an interesting question to me. Is that this exposure to this diversity and integration, as people are growing up in Sacramento and moving to Sacramento, how is that shaping the way that we make our decisions as a community, right? In a variety of different decisions, where we invest, where we, put government resources, et cetera. And I do think that it's making Sacramento a little different place than perhaps many other parts of the country.
When you have a wonderful data tool on your website, and when I look at it as a person who, does not have a lot of experience with it, it seems like that there are clusters of activity in terms of where there's low participation and higher participation. What's the interplay between all of these ethnicities that we have and this intermixing, and how ultimately people are elected and decisions get made?
Yeah. Well, first, I'll just, for those people that might want to check it out, it's called the Voting Location and Outreach Tool. It's on our website, cid.usc.edu. And it is a tool it's actually a national tool, but you can click on California, you can click on Sacramento County, and you'll see dozens and dozens of data indicators. So you can look at voting patterns, but also economic patterns, right? Data on poverty and income, population density, racial and ethnic groups broken out by subgroup, lots and lots of data. So to answer your question, I think just to piggyback a little bit on something that Dr. Pan said a moment ago, we still have patterns, right, in terms of participation. And it's very important that our elected officials, our decision makers, hear from everyone. It's important for everyone. It's not just the interests of the particular groups or groups that are increasing their voice, but elected officials need to know the full spectrum of wants, desires, needs, right, from their community as they are figuring out how they're going to distribute resources, right, to actually meet the needs of the region or the city or the jurisdiction. And right now, they're not actually fully hearing from everyone. We have great elected officials, as Dr. Pan was right, that reached out to hear from everybody, but not everyone's participating, whether it's voting or in other forms of civic, like talking to your city council or your board of supervisors. And part of that, there's lots of reasons for that. There are patterns where we see, there's predictors that are kind of have a compounding effect, right? So lower income, of color, young, for instance, right, will be less likely to participate. But also the system is much less likely, as you were just noting, to engage. And so even though we see integration in ways that are wonderful and important and are foundational and have real positive impacts, don't get me wrong, but we're talking about, decision makers and how it impacts them. Campaigns and candidates who still do the overwhelming amount of kind of political outreach in our society. They're the ones that have the money, the budgets. They're on an election cycle. They're reaching out to try to get those voters, but they're not trying to get everybody engaged. They're just understandably so, perhaps. They're just trying to get the people that they think are going to vote for them. And they generally, with wonderful exceptions, use likely voter modeling, looking at those predictors, and they reach out to the voters that are already very likely to vote for them, very likely to vote for period. Right. And maybe they trickle down, depending how competitive the election is. If it's not competitive at all, they're probably not doing much outreach. But if it is very competitive, then they're more likely to maybe go for those kind of intermediate voters or maybe some low propensity voters to try to flip them. But really, in any given election at any time, whole swaths of our potential eligible electorate, even those that are registered to vote, get very little outreach. If you're a young person of color, registered to vote, but you don't have a voting history yet, right? You are probably not going to hear from candidates and campaigns, where I assume we're all voters here. Many of your viewers get tons of mail and too much. They don't want the emails. They don't want the texts.
I'm one of those.
They don't want the calls, right? But maybe perhaps we don't all realize that. And when we see these numbers, we think, what's wrong with these communities? Why aren't these voters participating? Why don't they care? No. It's not about apathy. They care about their communities. They want, right, to have a voice. But they're not being asked to vote. They're not being given they're not getting the outreach and mobilization that we know from research, right, that campaigns know actually does make a difference. It is needed. So it helps to create those patterns. That's voting, but we could also have a whole other conversation about the likelihood of people, why they do and don't go to their city council, for instance.
Well, someone who's run for office, I will vouch for everything you said there about how campaigns work and so forth. Yes, that's exactly what happens.
Well, in your experience, what happens a lot of times is that people make assumptions. Okay? Overgeneralizations. That's a polite word for the stereotyping, right? Well, these type of people, and sometimes it's an ethnic lens, sometimes it's an educational or economic lens, are going to do this thing or that. In your own experience, how does one's ethnicity and sort of community that one comes from lend to how they express themselves and identify themselves in civic life?
Sure. Well, we all come with a history, right? My parents were immigrants from Taiwan, and they had their experience with how government worked back there, and they knew how important it was to engage. But also, in their experience as immigrants, first of all, when I grew up, I never saw anyone who looked like me, essentially elected office when I was in the East Coast. A little different when I finally moved here, but politics was not something that was considered a career option. And in fact, I never grew up, and my siblings never thought, we'd become president of the United States, right? I mean, that's like, forget about any other elected office, right? So that was kind of out of the radar at all. And in fact, when I first ran, my mother was kind of like, "You mean someone would actually vote for you because you're not the typical policy."
I hope you said, elected. "Well, won't you, Ma?"
Yeah. Yes, exactly. But I mean, because her experience, someone who's who immigrated and lived in the United States, was that you didn't really see. She did not see people looking like her who got elected. In fact, I'd like to point out that when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, I mean, certainly it was very important to the black community that we had a black president, but it was also important to the rest of us because it finally showed us that, guess what? You didn't have to be white to become president of the United States, okay? I mean, that was a big game changer,
Well, it's interesting you mentioned him, Senator Pan, because in an interview that I saw with him, he talked about, his multi-ethnic kind of background. Right. Father from Africa, Caucasian mother, raised in part by his grandparents, but also by his stepfather. And he he says, I'm as much Indonesian and Hawaiian, right, AAPI, as I am anything else. Yeah. And so this whole issue of ambiguity and for needs of things like, research and census and all that, we're always trying to squeeze people into this box.
So I guess one of the things I'd make mention is that, there's some people who may be listening who say, why do we have so much of a focus on race and ethnicity, right? Why can't just everyone's, just treat everyone the same, right? And the reality, unfortunately, is that if you're of a different race and ethnicity, depending what you are treated differently, inherently, right? And let's talk about some of the disparities that we see. So, for example, I think one of the more challenging one we talked about, income and so forth, is actually the wealth disparity. So where does the wealth disparity come from? Well, certainly there's both the historic, challenges of slavery for particularly the Black community and other parts of history. For Chinese Exclusion Act and so forth in the API community. But also I'd make note that the history of redlining meant that any property you owned, most of us don't own extensive pieces of property, we own a house, right, was going to be lower. It was basically going to be lower income neighborhoods. But even today, what we do know is that if you happen to be Black or your house looks Black in terms of your cultural preferences, they will praise your house lower, So therefore, when you buy a house and you try to sell it, you'll have less money coming out to buy your next house than someone who's not. That, so we can, so yes, ideally, we don't, like, oh, well, why should we talk so much about race? But unfortunately, for people who are of different races, we can't escape that reality. And that's why we have to have those conversations.
Dr. Romero, does that show up for you? How does that manifest in your work?
Yeah.
And I agree with everything you just said, of course. And so not only are people treated differently, both by society, by your institutions,
right.
But your example, Barack Obama, right? His varied background that he talks about, right?
Yes.
And has multiple identities himself as an individual. How is he treated? How is he labeled by society? The first black president. He's black. We have a long history of the one drop rule and so forth, right, in our country, dare I mention. So that's not a surprise, right? But when we think about, kind of trying to move beyond that, right? So people are treated differently. The reality is often when we talk about that, and many people are very well-intentioned about why they're bringing that topic up, right? They think, oh, it's dividing us, and we need to come together as a country. But often that kind of conversation actually leads to, intentionally or otherwise, policies that take us back to not identifying or lifting up communities and addressing disparities. Policies that are going to end up actually perpetuating or increasing the achievement gap, for instance, right? Or wealth inequality.
Right.
We have to understand through data, right? We have to understand those differences because they were real in their consequences and have policies that explicitly address those. Otherwise, we not only don't make progress, but we can feed the forces that end up wanting to potentially increase that, right?
Well, let me play devil's advocate on that.
Please.
And ask you a question. There are those who believe that so much of our use of technology to drill down and identify every single micro indice related to people and splitting them into smaller and smaller cohorts actually works against essentially promoting equity and equality because we're focusing on the things that make us different rather than the majority of things that make us the same and are a basis of collaboration. How do you respond to that?
And I see you probably want to jump in too, so I'll try to be quick. I would say that, again, they're real in its consequences, right? And so I think it depends on what you're using it for. So if we're trying to understand, it's medical research. Sorry to jump into that area, but the detail matters in terms of, right, subgroups, microgroups, if you will, right, that have particular risk factors. I will say, though, I absolutely agree with you when we talk about, like, cutting us in or breaking us up into 120 different demographic groups for the purposes of targeting, we talk about political outreach. We know for a very long time now in the United States, since we've had this ability, right, and all this big data, that where we used to be a broadcast world and a party or a candidate would outreach kind of to the masses and everybody would see, there's still some targeting, but everybody would kind of see what the message is, right? Now we have the ability, and it's the norm in politics, that everybody gets a sliced message that often, if one group saw the message the other group got, they go, oh, wait a minute, right? And it's really used for often manipulation, right? Misinformation, disinformation. There's a lot of negative from it. But so I think it depends on what we're talking about. And I'm sorry to...
All right. And quickly,
Sure.
I know that you wanted to jump in here. Please give us your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. No, and one of the things to keep in mind is also that we have a lot of people who are, 2 or 3 races, right? It is reported in the census. In fact, we've tried to change the census in a way to allow people to identify themselves the way that they truly want to identify themselves, because before it used to be you had to pick one, like, well, wait a minute, I'm actually, my parents, my father, my mother, whatever, it's a mix, right? And so, and what we noted in the last census was actually the number of people who reported they were 2 races or more actually increased significantly. So that's very important. But I guess in terms of trying to get at, okay, well, you just talked about the way people of different races and ethnicities are treated, and how do we overcome that? And you're right, exactly. We have to address it head on. At the same time, as we talk about Sacramento and our more integrated population, there's an opportunity for us to have those kind of conversations, I think, here that hopefully will strengthen our community and really lift everyone, right?
And I think that is the place that we will leave
That
it.
is perfect.
Thank you both so much for your insights and perspectives.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And that's our show. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time, right here on KVIE. All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.
Financial support for this program provided by Sacramento County's Transit Occupancy Tax Grant Program.